Hello and welcome to Beneath the Surface. I'm your host Hayden Hanna. On today's episode, we're talking climate change, Daoism, Planetarity, and the role of the university with Dr. James Miller. Dr. James Miller has established himself as a lead scholar on Daoism and ecology in China. His academic career began at Durham University in the United Kingdom, studying the Chinese language. Since then, he has served as the director of both the School of Religion at Queen's and the Department of Languages, Literature, and Cultures at Queen's University. Recently, he has taken a job as Professor of Humanities at Kunshan University, a Sino-American partnership between Duke University and Wuhan University. Welcome, James Miller, and thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you, Hayden. It's nice to talk to you and good to be on your podcast.
So you just finished your last book, China's Green Religion, Daoism and the Quest for a Sustainable Future, just under a year ago. So could you give us a bit of a cliff notes on this book and how it fits into your research overall?
So the book is really an exploration of how Daoism, which is China's indigenous organized religion, can serve as a resource for us to think about a basic ethical question of the relationship between human beings and the natural world. And the point of the book is to look at some key ideas that emerged in the history of Daoism over the past 2,000 years, and to think of these as serious challenges to the way that our modern society has come to create a kind of imbalance between human beings and the natural world. And if there's a kind of basic theme that runs through the entire book, it's very simply that in our modern way of living, we try as hard as possible to insulate ourselves from engagement with the natural world. And this undermines a key biological, scientific reality that human health is dependent upon the health of our ecosystems and environments and our planet, and that ultimately human flourishing and human life is dependent on the life and the livelihood and flourishing of all that surrounds us. Human beings are essentially liquid creatures. That's to say, there's a kind of porousness to human beings which we often overlook. And so we think about ourselves as being these individuals who are set off from or apart from the natural world. But and while this is maybe important for us psychologically, scientifically, of course, it's not correct. We know we can recite all of these basic facts. We're 70% water. We are part of this biogeological, chemical, hydrological cycle, but we've created a society, a way of living that imagines falsely that we are somehow immune to or invincible in the face of the natural world. And so what I'm trying to do is to think about what are the metaphors that we can use to somehow try and reintegrate ourselves into the natural world, or to begin to think of ourselves as dependent on or integrated with the natural world rather than set apart from or completely distinguished from the natural world.
So you mentioned that the kind of modern way of thinking, we kind of set ourselves apart from the natural world, so we think of ourselves as apart from it. So how did we begin thinking this way? Is it a cultural thing? Is it a cognitive process? Is it a result of our economic or political structures, or all of the above?
I think that it has been, at least one answer to this is that it's tied up with the development of classical science in the Enlightenment period, which one of its achievements was to think of the natural world as something that is objective. and can be examined scientifically and looked at as an objective reality that follows regular laws or patterns which we can detect through experimentation and observation. And this, of course, provided us with the ability to understand the laws of nature and also to manipulate nature through technology and engineering. And all of that has enabled us to build a kind of scientific or engineered way of living in the world. And I'm certainly not against science at all. What I'm trying to point out is a kind of unintended consequence of this, which has been to imagine the natural world as something that is inert or dead, a kind of material somehow that has no vitality to itself, no agency, and is something that we can just manipulate and use in a kind of infinite way. And one main consequence of this, of course, has been in the development of fossil fuel economics, which basically imagines that we can use the natural world as a kind of resource for human beings in an unlimited way. And of course, we know that that is not possible. We can't have this kind of unlimited use of fossil fuels because of all of the climate change that comes as a result of that. Economically, I think it's incorrect as well to imagine that we can have an economic system that is based on the infinite and unlimited transformation of natural resources into things that of economic value. We can certainly do that in a limited way, but we can't do it infinitely and universally and forever. And so this powerful scientific idea, which I fully support and recognize its value, has had these unintended consequences. And this has only really become known to us in the last 100 years with the development of post-classical science, something about environmental science, ecological science, and also perhaps we can think about quantum physics as way that these are modern, recent scientific developments that undermine the notion of the natural world as something that it can function somehow independently or as this objective reality outside of or separate from human beings. Because we know that from evolutionary science, we know that human evolution is tied into the evolution of and environments of our planet. We know from ecosystems that species don't flourish as some kind of unique or independent reality, but in relation to their environments and other niches as well. So this idea that we've built up for ourselves that we are somehow completely transcendent of the natural world is basically false scientifically. But we have built up a kind of social culture and economic culture, a way of living in the world that is based on a kind of flawed grasp of reality. And this is really what I'm trying to challenge.
Obviously, the ideas that are problematic are quite deeply ingrained in our society, at least for the past 300, 400 years, as you say, the classical Enlightenment period. And you've studied Daoism your whole life and come to these conclusions. How can sort of an ordinary person come to find some alternative to this modern way of thinking?
I think that all over the world, as people think about the question of sustainability or basically our unsustainable way of living, you can find emerging at multiple levels, whether it's at the grassroots level or whether it's at the highest political levels, you can find emerging a sense of unease about the way in which our current economic, social, political system is structured, and a sense of wanting to try to somehow change that or to find a new path for human beings on the world. And of course, this is an extraordinarily difficult task. For the one simple reason that this is a task that requires us to think in part globally or planetarily, right? And there are not that many times, I think, in human history where we've had to think about ourselves as a whole species, right? We tend to think about ourselves in terms of our families or in terms of our race or the countries of origin. But the realization of climate change and the significance of the transition to sustainability do require us to think about ourselves as a species level. And we've never really had any experience or training in how to do that. So, and I think this is, while we can certainly understand this from a scientific perspective, the big difficulty is how do you translate this scientific knowledge into something that is culturally powerful, politically relevant, and speaks to people in their everyday lives. And if I could give you an answer to that question, then you can nominate me for a Nobel Prize.
Sure.
So what I think that I'm trying to do is simply, I work in the field of religion and culture, and especially with reference to China. So this is what I'm trying to do in my corner of the world, and I'm trying to somehow extend this to hope that it makes sense to people in other parts of the world or people who do other kinds of things. And I think of this as hopefully a step into kind of meshing together a new kind of worldview, or a transition to a new kind of worldview or a new kind of way of doing business. I think you can think about, there are certainly points in human history where there have been kind of revolutions of understanding. I think the scientific revolution was clearly one of those, and it's something that emerged through a kind of rather complex history of cultural engagements between the West and the Arab world and also the Chinese world as well. But it was something that, for various particular historical reasons, emerged chiefly in Europe and has spread across the world. I think also we can think about, there was also a kind of another major transition that people refer to sometimes as an axial age, 2,500 years ago, where basic ethical paradigms emerged, whether in the lives of the Confucius or the Buddha or the emergence of early Greek philosophy. These were kinds of moments in the transition of human civilizations across the world. And I believe we're in the midst of another of these great transformations. I don't know precisely what will happen as a result of this, or if indeed it will happen before there's some kind of climatic catastrophe of some kind. But I think perhaps in 50 years' time we can historians will be able to look back and see this as part of a pattern of thinking that was helping to bring about a kind of new political, economic order. And it's a kind of a slightly scary thing because there are no kind of roadmaps for this. There's no precedent for the way in which human societies have really thought of themselves on this kind of species level before. So, and how to do that without falling into the traps of some kind of totalitarianism or other kinds of approaches is it's a kind of uncharted territory.
You get the sense we're in the belly of the whale a little bit, and we're just not sure if we're going to make our way out or not. So you spoke briefly. So if I understand you correctly, and I'm on the same page as you. Hopefully, with any luck, we're in a transition period into a more planetary way of thinking, and so could you dive into that a bit more? What's your vision of what a kind of a planetary ethic might look like?
So I think many of us are familiar with the concept of globalization, right? Which has meant that basically our lives, whether we live in Toronto or Beijing, are somehow connected through the web of goods and services and financial transactions and economic relationships that make our lives possible. So that as a result of that, we can make cell phone calls around the world and have this kind of sense of living in a global society, and all of the elements and the components of our cell phones are sourced from materials all over the world, and deliver us this thing that we can have put in the palm of our hands to call across the world. Planetarity means something quite different than that, and it's really a kind of an alternative to this concept of globalization. The basic idea of planetarity is that it takes an entire planet to make one human life possible. And this has really been something that has emerged in the fairly recent field of astrobiology. So that means the study of life on planets. And what scientists have discovered is that life as we know it, that is carbon-based life forms like you and me and cats and dogs, has only, so far as we know, emerged on planets. That is, and as a result of this, scientists have come to the conclusion that it's the complexity and depth and historicity of life of planets that has somehow enabled human life and human societies to emerge. And this is, so far as we know, an incredibly rare thing within the universe. And now, scientists are interested in looking for other planets that are capable of hosting life, and finding it enormously difficult. So the conclusion that I want to draw from this is that it's something about the planetary nature it's something about the complexity of planetarity that has enabled human life and human societies to take place. And that means if we don't have the planet functioning in the way that it does, we can't even have human life at all functioning in the way that it does. And I think this new kind of scientific reality really calls on us to think about and I think overturn the notions of that human beings are somehow exceptional creatures by virtue of their humanness. That's to say that as human beings, we are somehow completely different from the other kind of forms of life that we find on our planet, and also the processes of life that seem to inhabit the planet. And it's rather than, and yes, of course, human beings seem to be quite unique on the planet, but it's not because of us. It's not because of something that we have done that enables our uniqueness. Rather, the uniqueness of the human species and the uniqueness of our abilities is something that it seems that the process of of evolution of life on our planet has enabled to take place. So the uniqueness of the human species and the uniqueness of our abilities is a product of this process of evolution of life on our planet. So it takes an entire planet to make a single human life, and this really, I think, should be the basis of our thinking about what human life, what human ethics, what human society should look like.
Hey guys, sorry for interrupting the podcast. A reminder that Beneath the Surface is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're enjoying this podcast, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. The link can be found in the description. Now back to my conversation with Dr. James Miller. So my understanding is that you also have some ideas about the university's role in this paradigm shift.
Well, I think that there are basically two common approaches to thinking about what universities should be doing. I think one, which is the point of view of many students and their parents, is that universities should be somehow preparing people to take up jobs, right? And universities are professional training institutes helping people to become lawyers or scientists or doctors or whatever. So I have nothing against this concept of vocational training. What worries me, however, is that it seems that through enormous technological advances in artificial intelligence and all of these kinds of things, it seems quite unlikely to me that people who are in their 20s now will be able to enter a profession that remains radically unchanged over the course of their life, and that their experience will be quite different from the kind of experience of their parents. So why is it that parents want people to get these kinds of jobs? Because they think that it brings financial stability, that it's a kind of a career that will last them for a lifetime. But I think that really we're living in an age of disruption, and there are no careers that will last the lifetimes of people over the next 50 years. I mean, it's possible even that a lot of medical diagnosis perhaps could be taken place through artificially intelligent systems. It's possible that military campaigns can be plotted by artificially intelligent systems and be carried out by drones controlled by artificially intelligent systems. It's possible even that artificially intelligent systems will be designing the artificially intelligent systems to run these things, and so the kinds of skills that are going to be required for people to be successful, I think, are going to be quite different than what was required in the past generations, where you just train people to be a lawyer or a doctor or whatever, and they can enter into this profession. So I'm interested in thinking about what are the skills that we should be training people for, what are the kinds of knowledge that they will need, and that we should do this not based on what we've done for the last 100 years, but based on what we imagine reasonably will be required in the next 100 years. And I think this goes to my second point, which for me is perhaps a more significant point, which is that I think that universities offer programs and training that have developed that are really dependent on the way in which the world of knowledge was divided up in the 19th century, when all of our kind of classical disciplines, such as economics or political science or sociology or English literature, whatever, these kind of emerged as the main branches of the academic world. And people still get degrees in economics or political science, or they get this kind of training. But the training that they get is training to be in these kind of disciplinary niches, how to be another better economist, how to be a better political scientist. And certainly we need economists and political scientists. But I don't think that this way of training people in these disciplinary specialties is going to be very useful for them over the next 100 or 50 years, for the simple reason that the main problem that we have at the moment, or the main problem that we are getting to grips with, for me, is unquestionably that of climate change, and then secondly, this kind of emergence of a multipolar society, a multipolar world, where the Western liberal order is not the dominant kind of reference point in the world. So what I think people need to get in order to be successful in the next 50 years is firstly being trained to put together knowledge from different disciplines, rather than being extremely specialized in one kind of discipline. For the start, this means that they are more well-rounded, that they can move in a kind of hopefully more agile way from kind of one context to another context. And I think, secondly, it requires a deep grappling with our frankly racist histories and a genuine attempt to engage with different cultural, political, and religious traditions across the world, because the kinds of problems that we have to deal with are ones that are only going to be solved kind of globally. And this means people working together across cultural and political divides. But what we seem to see in the political world, in the global world, is a kind of hyper-specialization, hyper-nationalism, people retreating into their cultural and political comfort zones. And this is, I think, one consequence of training people in one particular cultural tradition, one particular narrow specialization. So in a word, I think we need people who are culturally fluent in multiple traditions and people who are intellectually agile, who can think outside of their disciplinary training boxes. And this is useful not only for their own careers as they emerge over the next 50 years, but is also, I think, cultivating the kind of people and the kind of society that can help grapple with the kinds of problems that many people are foreseeing emerging right now.
So, if I understand you correctly, and to kind of link up this to the beginning of what we were talking about, the modern way of thinking being ultimately unsustainable, is that you see the current university structure of disciplines as perpetuating this modern way of thinking, and which is ultimately not going to be helpful when dealing with the problems of the future, namely climate change.
Yes, and I think, that is to say that classical approach to science and social science knowledge has been to divide the world up into spheres of knowledge. So in physics, we look at something at an atomic level, and in chemistry at a more complex level, and biology at a yet more complex level. And science proceeds by this kind of disciplinary specialization. And that's very good, and I don't have any objection to that. The problem that I see is that in an issue like climate change, we have a very profound scientific understanding, but this has not properly translated into the political, the cultural, and the social worlds. So we have this image of all of the scientists having to somehow get the political and the cultural world to somehow get up to speed with what it has been doing. And I think this is a result of the fact that we have become, is that people are trained somehow exclusively in the arts or social sciences or in the sciences, and as a result, these two worlds somehow aren't connecting. So what I think we need at the moment, and I think it's a kind of a temporary thing, or it's something that, and I'm advocating this because I think it's urgently needed now, is people who can connect across rather than push forward and outwards separately. And our universities are really excellent at training people to push forwards outwardly and separately. And we call this innovation, right? They're really, really good at that. They're really, really terrible at this other thing. And I think we've become imbalanced in our university systems. And I think we need to have a much better training for people to somehow relate across cultural and intellectual divides.
Dr. Miller, it's always a pleasure. Thank you again for coming on the show and sharing your expertise on a very serious issue.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to my discussion with Dr. James Miller about climate change. A reminder that Beneath the Surface is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you like this episode, you should consider becoming a patron on our Patreon page. I'm your host, Hayden Hanna, and I'll see you next time.